Would you like to just go over preliminary of what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, you know, we really just wanted to spend some time talking about the experiences of dating, the experiences of sex and sexuality, and also religion when it comes to folks who are living on the autism spectrum disorder. We can get more into the nuts and bolts of what that really means, but it covers a wide range of neurological concerns that affects people's day-to-day lives in a whole bunch of different ways. And a huge part of that is people's ability to connect emotionally, romantically, sexually, and spiritually. And so I wanted to spend some time talking about, you know, just the different ways to overcome that, the different things to look for, and ways to understand and communicate with one another. And I have to say, I was a little concerned when I pitched the idea for this episode that nobody was going to be excited about it, that it was going to be, you know, a niche audience, or that, you know, folks around the studio wouldn't necessarily see the importance of it. But I have been really amazed at how excited everybody has been to get to this topic and to get to these issues. You in particular felt a real personal connection to this story.
I did, and I do. Having 3 siblings myself, and 2 of them being on the autism spectrum at differing points along that spectrum, it is definitely an important subject to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's also, I think, a large portion of the population that when we're talking about sex and sexuality and relationships and just interaction in general, that oftentimes gets left out of the conversation, but it is a huge part of the populace.
Yeah, absolutely. And we forget to include them at all, oftentimes. And then also, folks on the spectrum tend to be really infantilized. We see them as children that just didn't develop or that got stunted at a certain point, and that's not their reality. They're not children.
Not at all.
An adult with autism is an adult. Maybe they have a different view on the world than what's neurotypical, but they still have fully functional sexual lives and exist as sexual beings, and it's important to address that in a very different way than you would with a 12-year-old.
Right, and I think it's important to also remember that someone with autism isn't necessarily emotionally stunted. They have certainly more, what's the best way to put it? More barriers to communication.
Yeah, there's some obstacles there, but
definitely doesn't mean that they are necessarily emotionally stunted in any way, shape, or form. And I think we've made huge strides, and by we, a royal we, of course, we have made huge strides in the last even 10 years in communication, learning better ways to communicate with people who are further on the autism spectrum, who are nonverbal. It's not that they can't communicate, it's that we had not found the proper means yet.
Yeah.
And so, you know, learning all of these different things is very, it gives hope. I think.
And having these new avenues to communication was a thing that drew me to this topic, is honestly a thing that drew me to counseling and the field of psychology in general. You know, I had the privilege to see Temple Grandin speak a couple of years ago. She's actually coming back to Austin, for those of you who are local and interested. But she is an
I'll have to
activist
hit you up for
and a
deets
speaker.
on that.
Yeah, it's at the Stateside Theater. It may be close to sold out, but certainly worth it. I find her in particular to be a really remarkable speaker and activist, and more than anything, her work has focused on a lot of what you're saying, the reality that these are people with rich inner lives that maybe have some obstacles to communication, or maybe in another sense just have a different form of communication that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily share. And so there's a lot of bridging the gap there, not just changing them or bringing them to some different level, but actually recognizing that these are fully functional people that communicate in a way that is maybe outside of the norm or what's typical.
Right.
But is still fully valid in its own right. So I'm excited about that, and yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm really drawn to this field and to this topic.
Well, in that case, do you want to get started with, I heard you had an email.
Yeah, so I did want to take some time. We've been, as we said, getting some really great emails lately. We'd love to keep the conversation going even when the show's over. So please feel free to write in, sex@atheist-community.com. Org. Apologies. But yeah, this was one I wanted to spend a little bit of time with before we jump into calls. It reads, "Hello. This last year, my child has spoken to me about not wanting the male body and instead feeling like a girl. I personally fully accept my child and wish my child to live authentically and am fully behind that. My husband is from Jamaica and unfortunately carries that masculine, no child of mine attitude and talks about shame, even calling my child a freak or a clown. I'm aware of how damaging that can be to my child. My child has been referred to a gender development service and a child adolescent mental health services involved. I also take my child to gendered intelligence, and my child has met with other children with similar concerns and youth workers who are transgender themselves. So it definitely sounds like she's doing everything
she's taking the steps.
Yeah. But the concern comes here. My child's extended family, my mother, my brother, my sister-in-law, my child's cousin are Bible-believing dogmatic Christians. My child values relationships with extended family. They're not rude like my husband, but are disapproving of me. I'm under a lot of pressure to correct my child from husband and from extended family. My family say things like they feel sad about this and that I am guiding my child wrong. They believe the Bible is literally true. This has caused a big difference affecting the quality of my relationship with my family." And then this is the part that kind of started to break my heart a little bit. My child is having to be gender neutral much of the time. One key reason being my husband's bad reactions. He does things like saying he'll take my child to get a haircut. He has done this once, but at least allowed my child to keep some length rather than close cut all around. My child is now 10 years old. I allow my child to be fully girly. However, this is toned down a lot when my husband is around. Before he comes home from work, my child might need to change out of clothes or take hairbands out. We hide some of these clothes. I don't know if you have any advice on trying to get better support for my husband, for my child, or talking to my strongly religious family. Is there a way to argue in the context of the Bible? What might help to change my husband's viewpoint?"
Wow. So that is pretty powerful.
It's a lot to take on.
It is a lot. And something that concerns me a little in this particular situation is that most people who are originally anti-LGBT come around to the idea because someone close to them in their lives, a child, a brother, a sister, etc., comes out. In this case, it's a father and a daughter, let's be clear, and who is refusing to accept that reality. I worry that having a child with that, if you're not going to come around to having a child, then I worry
maybe
for that.
Stuck.
Yeah. I worry that that person might be permanently stuck in their line of thinking. That's not to say that they're, that they are permanently stuck or that they can't be dissuaded. With that dynamic, that worries me.
Yeah, my fear, my concern is very similar. That idea that, this is somebody who is being faced with their own child, that they clearly love and is just not having it. And I wonder if there was some way to convince him that this is not a phase, that this is not, gender can be very fluid, but that this is not something that's just not happening or that you can beat out of somebody or that you can force into a change. And I worry about sort of the code switching, the idea of this young girl having to be two different people, even in her own home.
Right, right. In the home where that should be her one refuge. And especially at that age, that is such a formative age to have one parent telling you, yes, this is fine, yes, be yourself. And then on the other hand, having the other parent, having to hide that from your other parent.
Sure.
I think that it could also be from the father coming from a place of loss, a feeling of loss, of losing a son.
Sure.
I don't know if this couple have any other children, but if this is their only child, I certainly can see where a feeling of loss, a feeling of bewilderment, especially if they are, as the emailer said, religious, or coming from a place of deep religious background, then of course that's just not right.
Yeah, so one of the questions was how to argue in the context of the Bible. And I always feel like that's kind of a slippery slope. I mean, definitely there's value in being able to meet people where they're at, being able to hear their own arguments, and frankly, to a certain extent, use the Bible, use their religious practice by bringing that up in the argument and pointing out that, you say you believe this, but the book actually says that, and, sussing through some of that. I don't know that there's a lot of value, though, in, like, quoting scripture at somebody and trying to out-argue them in that way.
Right, because you're using flawed material to fight flawed material to fight flawed material.
Well, and if internal consistency was a deal breaker,
then it wouldn't be an issue in the first place. The deal would have been broken.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I personally don't have a whole lot apart from just pure sympathy, to some extent, empathy for this family and for this little girl. But I don't really have a whole lot of advice for how to change someone's mind.
Sure.
That is not an easy task. And really, as I am a firm believer in therapy, as I am constantly told, you cannot change others, you can only change yourself. So I think the best thing you can do, unless you're concerned about some sort of violent reaction, which is a whole nother issue unto itself.
But one that's, very possibly in play.
Right. I would say if violence is not a factor, or the possibility of violence is not a factor, let your daughter be herself in front of dad. And show dad that he's not losing a son, he's gaining a daughter, and that daughter is wonderful and beautiful in her own way.
Yeah, and I mean, my heart breaks to just think about how tricky figuring a gender out is for anybody at that age.
Oh, goodness gracious.
I mean, even if you are a cisgendered woman, are you the type of woman who wants to start wearing makeup in your early teens? Are you more of the stereotypical tomboy? Like, what do you want to be, and how do you figure those things out can be really tricky for anybody as they're forming their own identity and getting permission to experiment and try different things and be different people. So, yeah, I definitely hear that.
Yeah. So I think wrapping this particular email up, there's no simple, easy answer to this situation. And if violence is a possible reaction in this situation, I think maybe some other additional steps might need to be taken to protect your daughter.
Absolutely. And yeah, I am not going to, off of a couple of paragraphs, try and prescribe a life-changing piece of advice, but it definitely makes me wonder, whether these relationships should be continued. Does dads still need to be around? Is that something that needs to be really looked at? You know, family therapy, relationship therapy, individual therapy, all of those things seem really vital because this is an uncomfortable and sticky situation.
I think ongoing help from local professionals local to you would be your best bet.